Thank you for listening to The History of the Papacy, an Agora Podcast Network member. We are on Facebook and Twitter, and if you have any questions, comments, or feedback, you can always send me an email to my email address, steve@a2zhistorypage.com. Now, if you like the history of the papacy, but would also like to have a little visual experience for the content, you are now in luck. I have partnered with Nick Barksdale of the Study of Antiquity in the Middle Ages YouTube channel to produce videos to go along with many of the History of the Papacy episodes. Nick also has many other videos as well, so I highly suggest you go and subscribe and hit the bell to find new great audio-visual content. He also works with many other great scholars and podcasters, including Laszlo Montgomery of the China History Podcast. You can search for The Study of Antiquity in the Middle Ages on YouTube or follow the link in the show notes. I will also have more updates on this great project in the future, so definitely keep tuned in, if you will. Now, today I have a special episode that was previously released as a special bonus episode on Patreon. But since I am no longer on Patreon, I wanted to release it as a thank you to everyone for listening. This is Sidetrack episode 71, titled The Church and Bank. In this episode, I explored the development of banking during the Middle Ages and how the church was involved in the movement of money and resources throughout Europe and the Middle East. The popes of Rome had and have a great deal of resources at hand, and how they managed those resources is fascinating. It really was important to the development of the Western economy throughout history. I will definitely be talking more about this subject in future episodes, and let me know if you would like to know more or if there's something specific you'd like to know more about. I'd like to just thank a few people who've donated through PayPal. Dapo, Roberto, and Peter signed up for monthly donations, but there's many ways to support the show. There's PayPal, of course, as I mentioned. There is PayPal, of course, as I previously mentioned, and then I set up an Amazon wish list where if you purchase one of those books, it will get shipped to me, and I will use it for research and for future shows. I also really enjoy reading your Apple Podcast reviews. Above all, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to listen, and as always, I look forward to seeing you on our next step on our trip through the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. This episode was supposed to be a mini episode for another podcast, but it just kept growing and definitely grew beyond the scope of the mini episode it was intended to be. I've been interested in the history of banking and finance for a long time. The areas of the history of finance, banking, and economics are not areas I have any particular academic training in. I do have an undergraduate degree in business, but that and $6 can get me a coffee drink at Starbucks. I used every opportunity in my business coursework to find out the origins of our modern systems. That's what really fascinated me. Since my graduation, I haven't used much of my business degree, but I have read many books on the subject. So now you know where I stand. This episode doesn't fit as a sidetrack episode, so I thought it would be a nice little thank you for you wonderful subscribers on Patreon, donators through PayPal, and reviewers on iTunes. I sincerely appreciate and I'm thankful to all of you. I hope you enjoy, and please let me know what you think of this special bonus episode. When you discuss banking, finance, and economics, they all really just boil down to how resources are allocated, distributed, and managed, and that has been a challenge facing people for a long, long time. Over time, the nature of the resources changed. No longer were people concerned strictly with what fed or watered themselves for that day or that week. After the agricultural revolutions, a series of events that occurred all over the globe, people had some extra. That allowed some people to not have to work full-time on gathering resources to directly feed their families. Along the way, between our ancestors' move from hunter-gatherers and our modern day of electronic currency and bitcoins, a lot has happened. Our focus in this special bonus episode will be to get to the financial system of the Renaissance. The Renaissance is the dawn of the modern banking system. By that point, almost all the pieces were in place to get to what we have in the financial world of the modern day. It all really goes back to the Romans. I'm sorry, I just can't help it. Everything always goes back to the Romans. If you have something called a Renaissance, you have to have a rebirth from somewhere. The collapse of the Roman Empire in Western Europe was more than just a military or civil government collapse. It marked a complete economic collapse, what you might otherwise call an economic recession or depression. This wasn't the type of economic recession that lasted a few months or even a few years. It lasted several centuries. The Romans had a highly complex financial and monetary system. They took coinage and the coin economy to the next level. Actually, they kicked it up several levels. The Roman mints produced good quality coins, and they produced a lot of them. The very vocabulary we use for money was really developed by the Romans. The word money itself was derived from the Romans. Even the word currency, the coins flowed from the imperial mints like the current of a river. Anyway, the Roman imperial government ran into very modern-sounding problems. Inflation, currency debasement, as well as income tax evasion and avoidance. The Romans knew that people used coins because they were reliable and eased transactions. Why not just make more coins then? Just slip a little silver into the gold coin or a little tin or something into a silver coin and voila. More coins and more purchasing power. Unfortunately, that's not how things work. People realize quickly a coin doesn't stretch as far as it used to, and word spread quickly if a coin wasn't made with the same amount of precious metal as it once was. In Roman times, this led to hoarding high-quality coins and eventual decrease in the coin-based economy. It got to the point where the Roman government didn't even want their own taxes paid in their own coins. Instead, they demanded taxes to be paid in kind, or with an actual good, be it animals, crops, manufactured items, or whatever. Production moved to large estates under the control of wealthy magnates. These large estates produced most of what they needed in-house, and if they did trade, it was usually in barter format or for really high-end goods. The invasions of the 400s and the 500s just kicked this whole process into high gear. Economic output and innovation stagnated for several centuries in Western Europe. The coin economy nearly disappeared. Stuff, useful materials, and goods are what mattered. A Viking raider might bust into a monastery or loot a town for any gold or coins, but just as important to Vikings or raiders was the accumulation of land, trees, and livestock. These are the things that mattered in the years after the fall of Rome in Western Europe. The use of coins didn't disappear completely, but coins just became much less common. This is about the time where common terms like shilling and penny enter the lexicon. In-kind payments and barter was the most common way of transacting commerce. Barter and in-kind payments can be easier than coins under certain circumstances. Take the example of me growing blueberries in my yard and my neighbor raising chickens for eggs in her yard. If I have a surplus of blueberries and my neighbor has an excess of eggs, we can pretty easily work out a trade so that we both have some eggs and some blueberries. Commerce becomes more tricky when the volume of trade increases, along with the distances traveled in order to trade. In the Dark Ages, distances were small and the volume was low. There are definitely examples of long-distance trade, but this trade was at nothing of the level of trade during Roman times. At this time as well, the taxation system set up by the Romans had almost completely collapsed. The successor kingdoms of the Romans in the West weren't collecting taxes either in coin or in kind in any systematic method. All that would change in the late 1000s, early 1100s. Agricultural output was on the upswing, giving people a bit more surplus to sell at market. All of this led to a general increase in economic output. Western Europeans were starting to stretch their legs a bit after many centuries of hard times. The Catholic Church, based in Rome, was feeling more confident too. Western Europe was packed full of nobles with incredible military training and equipment. They were also growing increasingly more wealthy. The Pope and a few of the most important secular authorities came up with an idea to harness some of that wealth and energy to meet their own strategic visions. The idea was to send knights to the Holy Land, more or less the eastern Mediterranean coast from the extreme southeastern end of Turkey south to modern-day northern Egypt. The Crusaders required coin more than ever. They could transport their weapons, horses, and other tools of war, but they could not transport every single supply they would need on a long trip from Western Europe all the way to the other end of the Mediterranean. Transporting large bags of specie, that is, coins made of precious metal like silver or gold, could be a very dangerous thing in medieval Europe, even for well-armed knights. The aristocrats heading off to crusade needed a way to safely and securely ship the large amounts of coin from their homes to the Holy Land and back again. A group of warrior monks called the Knights Templar evolved and took on that job. For a fee, knights could deposit their coins in one of the Templars' chapter houses in any one of the big cities in Western Europe, like London, Paris, etc., and receive a receipt or a certification he made the deposit. Then, once the knight hit the ground in the Holy Land, he could produce the receipt or deposit and withdraw his coin from the Templar office in Jerusalem. The Templar offices were actually well-fortified castles, and transporting the valuables wasn't a problem for the Templars because they were highly skilled warriors, specialized in transporting important cargoes, and not likely to be messed with by your average brigand. The Templars accumulated huge amounts of wealth and started to make loans to church hierarchs, kings, and even popes. Usury, the lending of money at interest, is highly frowned upon in the Christian religion for a number of reasons. The Old and New Testaments texts have quotes upon quotes against lending money at interest. There is even a canon law about usury at the First Ecumenical Council of Nicaea in 325 AD and subsequent councils. The Templars skirted around some of the laws against usury and developed instruments to avoid direct payment of interest. One way or the other, the Templars made a fortune. The Templars' military adventures weren't faring very well in the Holy Land, but their financial operations were skyrocketing. The Templars had problems, though. For one thing, their original mission was not in the financial world. They were supposed to be retaking the Holy Land, and they had failed at that. Yet somehow they became extraordinarily rich in the process. Some of the most important kings in Europe were completely in hock to the Templars. On top of that, the Templars were a secretive order with many arcane and unusual rituals. That gave the severely indebted kings and princes plenty of ammunition to take down the Templars and wipe out their debts. So that's what they did. In fact, the King of France in the early 1300s rounded up all the Templars in his realm and persecuted them, eventually executing all of the leadership. The Pope assented to this because the King of France was so powerful. There's much more to the story, but in short, the King of France and the other princes got out of debt, but they also still needed to borrow, so new ways of financing developed. The King of France at that time, Philip the Fair, took some other monetary actions that are worth quickly noting. He continually messed with the precious metal content of the French coinage. He tried to debase the coinage. That had a negative outcome we would expect. So he reissued the coins back at their previous precious metal content. He actually did this back and forth game several times, expanding and decreasing the coin supply and circulation. Merchants, traders, and commerce rely on a stable coinage, but as with the fall of the Templars, nothing was stable economically at this time. Templar banking was a financial method reserved for most powerful aristocrats in Europe, really exclusively. The Templars were a version of a multinational bank. They survived and thrived with the blessing of the Pope and support of the highest-ranking nobility in Europe. Once that support disappeared, it was very easy for the Templar debtors to wipe out the debt by wiping out the Templars. The assets of the Templars were either taken by the respective states they operated in, the church, and some assets were passed on to other military religious orders such as the Knights Hospitaller. These new orders that got the money naturally stayed out of the field of high international financial operations, expectedly. The nobility of Europe still needed money after the floor fell out on the Templar banks. There were still crusades to go on, wars to fight, castles to be built or destroyed, and all that. At about the time the Templars were in decline, a new form of banker was on the upward swing. Banks based in northern Italy were rapidly growing throughout Europe. These northern Italian banks were much smaller, family-run businesses that were founded on commercial banking. The northern Italian banks of the 1300s were the motive power of the Renaissance. Small-scale banking in northern Italy and places such as Genoa, Venice, and Florence in the 1200s is where it was going on. Northern Italian banking evolved just as Templar banking evolved over the course of time due to favorable circumstances. There were differences between northern Italian banking and Templar financial operations, though. Two big differences were that northern Italian bankers developed their financial operations out of pre-existing commercial activities. Secondly, even at their largest extent, northern Italian banking concerns were family-operated partnerships, thus creating limited liability. The northern Italian bankers were all about business and formed new corporate structures to expand along with safeguarding their business interests. Let's quickly explain how banking in northern Italy developed. The city-states of northern Italy were perfectly situated to capitalize on the commercial benefits of the Crusades. The cities had good ports and built merchant fleets which could bring armies and their supplies to Constantinople and the Holy Land. Western Europe was starting to come back economically, and the nobles wanted silks, spices, and all of the other luxury goods of the East. A major change happened in the mid to late 1200s AD, which would really solidify the commercial power of the northern Italian city-states. Up to this time, the gold coins of the Byzantine Empire were the gold standard, if you will, of the coin-based economy. The Byzantine gold coin was essentially the reserve currency, along with the Islamic gold coins based on Byzantine gold coin models. The Byzantine Empire was hit with some very difficult times in the 1200s, and they were compelled to debase their coinage. The northern Italian city-states developed their own pure gold coins, such as the Venetian ducat and the Florentine florin. These coins started to push out the Byzantine coinage in trade. This helped the northern Italian city-states immensely in building their trade and consequently their wealth. The northern Italian bankers hit the European fair scene of Europe. They used benches to set out their wares, which in this case was money. The Italians called their benches banchi or banchi. This is where we ultimately get the name bank from. These Italian merchants and money provided small loans to other merchants and producers. They also exchanged currencies, which greatly helped ease commercial activities and trade at these fairs. They had the old problem of lending money at interest. The church still had a problem with that one. The Italian bankers developed complicated loan techniques that worked around the usury prohibitions. Usury in the lending of money is still against the rules to this day officially in Catholic Church circles, but around this time people started to become more comfortable with the necessity of lending and borrowing money. Your average person didn't necessarily need financing at this time, but the ability to borrow was important to the merchants. Merchants and traders of all levels have a problem. It's a problem of cash flow. People had goods, a type of asset, but not necessarily an asset they could use to buy something. Here's a very simple example that is applicable to England during the 1300s. England was known for growing sheep with exceptional wool, but they didn't turn the wool into cloth. They needed to trade it to continental Europe, where there were weavers who would process the wool into cloth. Now, say a merchant showed up in England with a boat full of wine or iron ore, and the wool producers didn't need those items. Well, there wouldn't be a transaction. In econ talk, the market wouldn't clear. Cash would help make the transaction clear if the merchant had cash to use. Certain merchants accumulated an excess of coin and started to lend it out to other merchants. These bankers lent money to merchants and started to fill the gap where the Templars left off in the big nobility money game. Families such as the Peruzzi, Bardi, Alberti, and later de Medici helped fund many conflicts, including famous English conflicts like the 100 Years' War and the War of the Roses. You can see why bankers get a bad rap then. These banking families were making a profit off of people getting killed in war. Of course, we shouldn't ignore that it was the kings who were fighting for their own power and scrounging up cash wherever they could that were killing the people too, but let's not split hairs here. A pre-Renaissance was happening in Europe during the 1300s. Western Europe was on its way back. Markets and industry were on the increase until the bottom fell out on everything in an apocalyptic fashion. In a way, you could even blame the northern Italian merchants, because they were traveling so far and wide in search of new trade goods. They went so far and wide, they ventured into the area where a certain plague was, the Black Plague. Genoese merchants brought back the plague to Europe and significantly set back the development of the whole western end of the continent. Over the course of the decades of the mid-1300s, up to 1/3 of the population all over Europe died, and 2/3 of the large urban area population fell. The social impact of the plague was immeasurable. Not only that, the economic impact is difficult to imagine. All markets, labor, agriculture, financial were all put into complete disarray. The old way of doing things was dead, literally. The Black Death of the mid-1300s is the break between what was medieval and Renaissance banking and commerce. The Black Death wasn't the only thing that would seriously hurt the old-school northern Italian banks. An English king, Edward III, racked up an unbelievable amount of debt with several Italian banks. They lent Edward money hand over fist. Edward did something kings have a way of doing. He defaulted on his loans, meaning he didn't pay them back. The loans were all unsecured, meaning there was no collateral backing them, and frankly, what could the banks do to collect if the king didn't want to pay? Philip the Fair of France didn't want to pay, so he found a way to kill all the Templars. Edward III didn't go that far, but several Italian banks were forced to shutter their doors. Now, after all of that, we are finally at the Renaissance. Banking, money, and commerce made the Renaissance. Families who grew incredibly wealthy from the boom in banking and finance invested their money in art and architecture. One of the most famous of all these Renaissance banking families was the de Medici family. The de Medici used wealth derived from their vast banking and commercial operations to essentially purchase their way into the aristocracy. Think of any of the biggest names in Italian Renaissance art and architecture: Brunelleschi, Donatello, Michelangelo, etc., etc. All received commissions from the Medici. The Medici and other bankers also introduced Europe to science and mathematical innovations. One innovation was to use the use of new accounting methods that completely changed the way business was and is done to this day. The use of double entry accounting was introduced during the Renaissance. It might seem like a small thing, but double entry accounting allows for a very accurate records to be maintained, and that information can be used to develop reports that managers can use to determine the needs of their business. They even began to use the terms debits and credits at this time. Two other innovations that were borrowed from their dealings with the Islamic world were also hit the scene at this time. Business concerns were the first Europeans to adopt Arabic numerals and the concept of zero. Arabic numerals and the concept of zero as a placeholder were embraced wholeheartedly by Western European bankers. Then eventually scientists and mathematicians ran with that concept. The old Roman numerals are basically impossible to use in any calculation period, no qualifications. Traders and merchants would use abacuses to do the most basic figures. Once merchants had Arabic numerals in their hands, though, they could make many simple computations right in their heads. It was almost seen as magic or even sorcery. Imagine it, before you'd need this crazy machine that would require learning a proto-computer programming language to use, but once you got comfortable with Arabic numerals and zero, you could figure out almost any day-to-day transaction on a piece of scrap writing material, or even on the ground with a stick or something. For those interested in higher finance and dealing with more complicated applications, a new world of not only finance but science and mathematics just exploded. For the Medici, banking and finance was a means to an end of purchasing their way into the most important institutions of northern Italian society. Business became more and more of a sideshow to placing family members in high-ranking positions, even the papacy. There were 4 Medici popes: Leo X, Clement VII, Pius IV, and Leo XI. Leo XI has the honor of having one of the shortest reigns in papal history, just 27 days. The Medici became dukes of Florence, and running banks became a lower priority. The next big jump in banking and finance came during the 1500s with the rise of the New World empires and the massive wars that would rock Europe. The Age of Discovery brought into Europe new and unimaginable goods to be traded, and endless wars created a need for a massive amount of resources. This is the period often called the birth of the modern age. We'll leave that one for another day, though. I think we've done a lot today. I could go on these topics in much greater detail, and I just may. Please let me know if you enjoy these types of bonus content episodes, and I'll work on them as time allows. Editing services today are provided by Matt Hughes, and the introduction music for this episode is called Intended Force by Kevin MacLeod in Comtech.com, licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 3.0 licensed. Thank you again, and I'll be talking to you soon on both the History of the Papacy podcast and Beyond the Big Screen, and I really appreciate all of your support. Thank you so much.